Victoria, thank you for reminding me. We also have Wi-Fi hotspots available. So if you have trouble getting internet at your house or at wherever you do most of your schoolwork, we have hotspots that connect to the T-Mobile network that you can use to connect to Wi-Fi and get your work done that way. Those are available for pickup as well. Good call, Victoria. All right, let's see here. So like I was saying a little bit earlier, tonight we are going to go into kind of a really big picture look at these ecosystems over the course of a really long period of time, dozens or hundreds of years. As always, I'm going to make sure to record this class, and then I'll post it right here in the class recording section after we finish up for tonight. So if you ever want to go back and rewatch the notes on your own time, you will be free to do so. So the fancy science term for this big scale change over time is called succession or ecological succession. And it's basically sort of the process by which ecosystems go from kind of small, sparsely populated areas to big, filled in environments with lots of different types of plants and animals all interacting with each other. So today we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what is ecological succession, how does it work, where do we start with, and what do we end with? So this is all about ecosystem level changes, how these big areas change over the course of a really long period of time. So succession is a natural and gradual change in an area. Natural meaning that it's not man-made or man-created. It happens in nature. And gradual because it often, especially in the case of primary succession, which we will talk about, it often can take hundreds of years for the whole process to work out. And so over those hundreds of years, there's this very, very slow change in the different types of plant and animal species that live in an area. So there's two different types of succession that we're going to go over tonight, called primary succession and secondary succession. So the big thing that happens with succession is the change in plant communities. So animal communities will change a little bit and will shift over time. But in the really, really big scale of things, it's the different types of plants that are being slowly turned over and replaced as this process of succession goes along. So the plants that we start with are going to be very different from the plants that end up as sort of our final main species in an area. So it's this natural, gradual process, takes a really long time, and mostly has to do with the replacement of one type or one group of plant species with another one. So the first type of succession that we're going to focus on today is called primary succession. And in primary succession, the main characteristic is that it begins in a place without any soil. Basically just bare rock is there. So no dirt, no like little shrubs or anything, no grass, nothing. So this would be like sides of the volcano if there was a somewhat recent volcanic activity that just kind of smothered everything with volcanic rock. Or in the case of islands, if it's like brand new rock that's just starting to come up out of the ocean on an island. Landslides can start the process of primary succession. So if you have a big landslide where all of the soil and all of the dirt gets covered over and wiped away by rocks or by flooding, then you can have primary succession start again. Yeah, landslides and flooding kind of go together. But the big thing is that it doesn't have any sort of soil or dirt or earth. Nothing is there. It's basically just bare, flat rock, and that's it. That is an indication that we're dealing with primary succession. Secondary succession, which we'll talk about a lot more in a little bit, means that you already start with some plants and dirt in an area. Primary succession, you've got rocks, you got some rocks, and you got rocks that you're dealing with. So generally, to begin this first stage of primary succession, tiny little plant life forms called lichens will start growing on top of the rocks. So lichens are really, really small plant-like species. They are kind of similar to moss, except they're like an even more basic version of moss. I'll show you some pictures of what they look like in a second. A lot of times you can see them growing on like the sides of trees around Austin. So like the live oaks that we have here, the trees that are like the most common one. Sometimes you can see some sort of like light greenish, light bluish greenish stuff that kind of flakes off the side. That stuff is lichens. So the reason that they can move in first is that they do not need any soil to start growing. Most plants, they have to have a little bit of soil there so they can put their roots down into that. Lichens can start growing immediately right on top of all those rocks that we're dealing with. So after the lichens have been living there for a while, again, this could be dozens and dozens of years, they'll start to build up a little bit of a soil layer in a process that we'll talk about in just a second. And so after a little bit of soil has been up, some mosses, some different really simple, small species of plants will start to be able to grow and kind of keep that soil in place. So lichens don't need any soil. Mosses only need a really, really thin layer of soil. So these guys are called pioneer species. They're called that because they're like the first explorers onto this bare new land. They're the first settlers that are coming out to stake their claim on this bare, rocky wasteland that primary succession is dealing with. And so they're pioneer species because they're like the first. They're striking out into this bold new territory and starting to build it up that in a way that future species can take advantage of. So here are those lichens I was talking about earlier. Again, they're growing right on top of the rocks. So they're this kind of like brownish, greenish, bluish color. And over time, the lichens will actually slowly break down sort of the very outer layer of the rock. And as they're doing this, that is what causes the first little bit of soil, the first little bit of dirt to form. So we have these lichens, they're breaking down very, very slowly this rock, little by little. A little bit of dirt is starting to form here and there. And then where that dirt is starting to form, we can have these tiny little mosses are able to move in, grow on top of that dirt, and kind of hold it in place. We don't want that dirt to be wiped away by like wind or water, because then other species in the future won't be able to use it. So these mosses very kindly come along and trap and hold on to that dirt for us. So we're starting to very slowly develop a little bit of kind of this soil layer on top of the rock. And it's all thanks to these lichens breaking down the rock and these mosses holding it in place. So these are our pioneer species, our first living organisms that come in to colonize this flat, rocky wasteland. So again, the reason why we're getting this soil here in the first place is these lichens are very, very slowly breaking down the rock. And the weather is helping too. So like rainfall and stuff is kind of helping to erode that top layer of the rock away, break it down a little bit more. Not only are the lichens breaking down the rocks, but lichens don't live too terribly long. They're very simple species with a fairly short lifespan. So when they die, they then start to decompose, like the bacteria that are around will start to break down the lichens. And that adds in a little bit of nutrients to the soil that's forming. So you've got this soil that's made up of like these lichens and these dead lichens and this broken down rock. And so that soil is slowly starting to build up over time. And over the course of many, many, many years, it'll start to build an actual layer of dirt on top of our rocks. So we've got these lichens, they're breaking down the rock, and then they're dying, and new lichens are breaking down the rock and dying, and the dead lichens and the broken down rock are coming together to form the soil. So here you can kind of see, this is a little bit later on, but this stuff around here is just rock all around this part. But then in here is where the lichens and mosses have started to move in and take over and eventually create enough soil so that we can start having some small plants grow, like some small grasses and flowers and stuff like that. So it's all due to the lichens and the mosses breaking down the rock and dying and adding their sort of biomass to that broken down rock. So they're slowly building up this little layer of soil. All these kind of dead plants and broken rock all combining together. So eventually, when you have a small amount of soil that's built up over time, you can start getting in some very simple plants that don't need really thick roots. So things like more complex mosses are able to move in, so some bigger moss species, as well as some ferns. So ferns have really shallow root layers, so they are able to move in and start taking advantage of this sort of very small layer of soil that's building up. And then the same process is still going on. The plants are breaking down the rock, and then the plants are dying and adding their nutrients to the soil. Eventually, again, years and years and years pass of this same process happening. Plants dying, adding nutrients to the soil, new plants growing, and then dying and adding nutrients. So you start to build up a thicker soil layer. And so now, because there's more soil, you can get more types of plants, things like grasses and wildflowers, and other types of slightly larger plant species. So the main way that these different plants are getting here is seeds carried by the wind. So seeds are coming in from nearby ecosystems that have already developed, have already gone through succession. And now there's the seeds of those plants are traveling on the wind and settling in sort of this brand new soil area. So we're getting more and more soil over time, so we can get more and more complex plants moving in. Eventually, a couple decades go by, those grasses and wildflowers have lived and died, contributed their nutrients and their biomass to the soil. So the soil level is starting to get even deeper now. So now we can get some shrubs, we can get some small trees that can start really putting some deep roots into this soil and growing and developing. Now with all these different types of plants that we have in here, we can host more animal life. So with the lichens and the mosses, we can't really have all that many animals that survive there. There's just not enough nutrients. But as we get these grasses and wildflowers and shrubs and trees developing, We can have insects, we can have some small birds, some small mammals start to move in and live in the area. So we started off with completely bare, rocky wasteland. But over the course of, I don't know, 50, 70, 100, 200 years, now we have all sorts of different species all living and interacting in this area. So we start off with this bare lichen, or this bare rock. Those little tiny lichens move in, start breaking things down, start building up that soil layer. We can start getting some moss that holds on to that soil for us. Eventually, the lichens and the moss together have built up enough soil so that we can start getting in some ferns, some herbs, some weeds that start to kind of poke through. Eventually, some more seeds will fly in on the wind from nearby ecosystems. So some small grasses can start growing. And then after a little while, the soil is deep enough to support shrubs, and then some smaller, fast-growing trees like pine trees and hickories. And then eventually, the soil is deep enough and the seeds of different trees have been around long enough that some of the really long-lasting, very, very large hardwood trees like oaks and walnuts and maples can start to grow and develop. So again, because we're starting at such a kind of bare spot at the beginning, this process can take hundreds of years. So it could be 100, 150, 200 years between where we started with the bare rock and these large kind of adult trees starting to really grow and develop. All right, so that's sort of the main idea and the main process behind primary succession. We start with nothing. Over time, as plants move in, grow and die, they add to the soil. So the soil keeps getting deeper and deeper, which means that we can support more and more different types of plants. Another thing that happens with succession is as these grasses and shrubs and trees start to move in and take over, a lot of times they will outcompete these smaller organisms, these smaller plants for resources. So all of a sudden, the lichens and the mosses aren't really able to keep up with these more complex organisms. So that's where sort of this replacement of the different plant species happens. As you get further along into the kind of more mature forest, you'll see less and less of those pioneer species around. There's fewer and fewer areas where they can survive. They're kind of being slowly replaced over time by these larger and more mature plant species. All right, so that is primary succession in a nutshell. Does anybody have any questions about this process? Anything that you want me to go back and kind of explain a little bit more?
Nope, sounds good.
Good.
All right. So that is our primary succession. Again, it's primary because we're starting off with a whole lot of nothing to begin with, just bare rock, and that's it. In contrast, there's another type of succession known as secondary succession. So it's the same general idea of primary, of we're developing new plants and larger plant species over time. But in secondary succession, we already are starting in a little bit more advanced stage. Secondary succession occurs in areas that already have some plants and soil living in them. And most of the time, it's something that used to be the home of living organisms. So what do I mean by that is this used to be a kind of mature area, but then something happened, some sort of disturbance event went on, And now we're going to have to kind of restart the process. Luckily, though, not from the very beginning. So secondary succession occurs a lot faster than primary succession, again, because we already have that soil layer laid down. And it has different pioneer species. So those little lichens and mosses, we don't really need them again because we already have this soil layer laying down. So we can already start off growing things like the grasses and the wildflowers. So secondary, we're already starting off with some stuff in our favor. We've got our soil, and usually we have some plants and some seeds already kind of in place in that soil. So after a forest fire is a really great example of a secondary succession. A lot of stuff may have been killed off and burned up, but there might be some stuff that remains. Minor floods can also cause secondary succession, or major storms like hurricanes or tornadoes that rip a lot of stuff up and kill off a lot of the plant and animal life that's there, but don't completely wipe out all of the plants or all of the soil, right? There's still some stuff that survives and carries on after these big disturbance events. And that's where this secondary succession comes into play. So in this sort of super simple cartoon version, we have our nice big mature forest, but something happens, a wildfire tears through it, burns up a lot of those large trees and shrubs, and leaves us with a fairly bare patch of soil. But we have the soil in here already, so seeds are able to pretty quickly move in and start growing, or maybe there were some seeds that were already in the soil that weren't affected by the wildfire that can start growing right away. So immediately we get some grasses and flowers that start to come back pretty soon after the disturbance rolls through. Then within a few years, we can start developing those shrubs and those smaller trees. And then eventually the wildflowers and shrubs will start to give way to these kind of medium-sized trees, and eventually we'll be back to our original kind of stand of these large, mature adult trees. So same general process of primary succession of developing these smaller plants and then these medium-sized plants and then these larger plants, but happens a lot faster, a lot more quickly than primary succession because we already have the soil and the seeds can already start to pretty quickly grow after the disturbance event has moved through the area. So this is that same kind of idea, just in a little bit different kind of detail. So after this fire or whatever sort of disturbance it is moves through, maybe a hurricane comes through and knocks down a whole bunch of the trees and shrubs, but we still have the soil and we still have these kind of small weeds and grasses and flowers that hung around. Eventually, those will develop into the more thick kind of grasses and flowers and some smaller shrubs. And then after a relatively short period of time, maybe only 30 or 40 years, we can already start getting back to the kind of medium and large sized trees that were there before the disturbance. That's just kind of another picture showing that same thing. So again, within a couple years, you start to get like flowers and grasses and weeds moving in. Within about 10, 15 years, you start to get the shrubs and the seedlings and saplings. And then within 50 years, you have a lot of pine trees, which are fairly fast growing, that develop. And then maybe only 100 or so years after that initial disturbance, you have a fully matured kind of hardwoods, the slower growing, larger trees that are developing. So whereas primary succession maybe is 200 to 300 years. Secondary succession could be half that, 100 to 150 years. This example, I think, is really cool. This is an actual experiment that was conducted on an abandoned cornfield, where essentially, instead of converting it into something else, scientists just let it sit for 20 years and came every summer and made observations of the different species of plants that were there. So this is essentially 1 year after the field was abandoned. It's still mostly kind of dirt and these dead corn stalks that are just hanging around here. I lived in Ohio for a few years and did a lot of research on animals that lived in cornfields. And believe me, a lot of them looked like this at the end of the year. So by the second year, we already have filled in most of this cornfield with wild grasses and flower species from the nearby forests. So you can see over here, we have this nearby perfectly healthy ecosystem. So all the seeds from that can drift over and incorporate onto this cornfield. By year 10, which is this kind of top picture up here. Actually, no, this is year 5. So year 5, you have larger and taller grass species. You have some small shrubs and plants that are starting to move in. After 10 years, you have these medium-sized shrubs that are really starting to stick out from the ground around them. And then just 20 years after this completely abandoned dirt and dead cornfield, there are all sorts of different types of grasses, of seedlings. There's juniper trees, there's young birch trees and maple trees, there's some blackberry shrubs that are developing. So all of these plant species grew and developed and matured here just within the 20 years of people stepping back and essentially just watching what happens in this abandoned cornfield. So in a relatively quick amount of time, scientists saw this huge amount of regrowth of species in this area. All thanks to secondary succession, or this kind of stepwise process of having an area that has soil on it already start to have these different types of plant species move in as it gets further and further and further after whatever disturbance event initially caused it to be wiped clean. So like I was saying, it starts off with, we have our bare soil. We get an initial influx of seeds, either from the soil itself or from nearby ecosystems. So these grasses start to grow. Pretty quickly, we're able to get some larger shrubs that are able to move in and start growing and developing. And then the fast-growing trees are kind of our next group. Things like pine trees and juniper trees. And then eventually, maybe 50 or 100 years after the disturbance event, we're able to develop these large, slower growing hardwood trees. So this is kind of classic secondary succession, going fairly quickly from grasses to shrubs to large mature trees. So we used to have a nice mature forest, but then it got burned down. So we have, in this case, our pioneer species are things like grasses and flowers. They're then able to develop into sort of our intermediate species of shrubs and pine trees, and eventually reach our climax community, which is our kind of large, heavy, mature trees. But again, it all starts with still having this fairly rich soil environment to grow off of. Unlike with that primary succession, where it was just bare rock and we literally had to start from scratch. All right. I know, Angelica, super interesting stuff. So anybody have any questions about the secondary succession, secondary versus primary succession, anything that we've gone over so far this evening? Any questions about that?
No.
No, thank you.
All right, great. Okay, so succession is all about this very slow, gradual process, watching as these different groups of plants slowly move in to new areas over time. Whether we're dealing with primary succession, where we're starting at that bare rock and slowly building up those lichens and mosses so that we can get the soil going, or whether it's secondary succession, where we're returning our groups to kind of where they were before. Yeah, so one of the really cool things about fires is that some species are fire resistant. So some species are able to kind of resist the fire, or even if the adult versions aren't, the seeds in the soil are able to resist the effects after a fire. And then, like we've seen here, ecosystems, well, it's a pretty long time for human years, like 20 years is a pretty good amount of time for humans. But in terms of like the Earth's timeline or like a plant's timeline, that's not too long at all, really. And so relatively quickly after these big kind of destructive events, I mean, even within a couple of years, we can already start to see grasses and shrubs and stuff return to the area. So within just 100 years of this incredibly destructive event, we may be able to see kind of species and areas return to what they looked like very similarly before that even happened. All right, so we have these pioneer species that move in, start to develop, turn into these intermediate species, and then kind of the ending point of succession, or where we kind of stop having these new and different species move in, is known as the climax community. So a climax community is a fairly set and stable group of plants and animals that's basically like the end result of succession. So this is what all of those years of succession have sort of been building towards. Once the climax community is set and becomes settled in an area, you're not really going to see much big changes in the plant community anymore. So for all of the examples that we've been looking at, we've kind of been looking at your traditional hardwood forest ecosystem. So things in like East Texas or the Northeast or the Midwest, where you have these big, sturdy forests. So we've been talking about how you go from the lichens and mosses to the grasses, to the pine trees, to the big hardwood trees. But not every single ecosystem on Earth is a forest ecosystem, right? Sometimes we have things like jungles or swamps or deserts or tundras or prairies. So you're not always going to see a climax community of big, tall, strong trees, right? Because not every ecosystem is built to have those things survive there. So you can have different climax communities in your different ecosystem. So in prairies, like the big prairies, that would be somewhere like Kansas or Nebraska. For the most part, the ecosystem there can't really handle these big trees moving in and living there. So there, the climax community is specific species of grasses. So once a kind of certain community of grass is reached, that's sort of where the succession stops. It doesn't really develop into that shrub or tree phase. And the deserts, maybe your climax community is more things like cacti or scrub bushes, stuff like that. So just because you're at the climax community doesn't mean that it has to be big, tall, foresty trees. All it means is that you've reached sort of the stable group of plants. And so you're not going to get really any new invasion of a huge wave of different types of plants. So again, sure, if you're in a forest or a jungle, then climax communities are going to be big, tall, long-living, impressive trees. But if you're in like a prairie or a desert, then your climax community is going to look a little bit different. So your climax community maybe is going to be a bunch of thin grass and shrubs, or maybe it'll be almost nothing at all, tiny little patches of plants here and there. So the climax community is just essentially the end result of succession. It's the final group of plants and animals where we're not really going to see succession continue and keep building on new groups of plants. We're pretty much going to be set with the groups of plants and animals that we have until we have another disturbance event kind of roll through. So when we've reached the climax community, we tend to see a high level of what's known as biodiversity, which just is a fun science way of saying lots of different plants and animals. So once we've reached that climax community, it usually tends to mean that we have all sorts of different trees and shrubs and plants and animals all living in that ecosystem. So like I was saying, this is stable. We're not going to really get any new big sweeping changes of organisms. And it'll mostly kind of look like this until another disturbance clears the area. So once we've reached the climax community, that essentially means that succession in that area has finished for the time being until another disturbance wipes out a lot of those species, and we have to kind of begin the rebuilding process once again. So when that disturbance does go through, it tends to reduce the biodiversity of our communities, right? A lot of plant species and animal species are likely either going to be killed off or driven away by the disturbance, and it'll take time for them to slowly start coming back to the area again. So scientists and ecologists, people that study ecosystems and environments, really like to see a large amount of biodiversity in an area, in a community, because it tends to mean that that's a very stable community that is healthy and happy and has been living like that for a good amount of time. So obviously, major threats to these climax communities, these stable, biodiverse community, includes some of the things that we've been talking about, things like forest fires that go through an area, or other natural events like flooding or volcano eruptions. Obviously, those can have a huge impact and potentially even revert a community back to having to go through primary succession again if there is enough lava flow. Humans also are very, very good at disturbing these climax communities. So when we're building out into an area, we tend to want to get rid of a lot of the plant life that lives there to make room for the humans that want to move in. So we mow down all the grass, we start paving over a lot of the species that are there, we start putting up office buildings or homes or apartment buildings in order to make it easier for humans to live there. But obviously, homes and streets and apartment buildings and offices are not part of the climax community. They're not a natural part of the environment. So that can have a big impact on the stability and the biodiversity of an ecosystem. Also, when we need to make food for all these humans that are living there, clearing out a community so that we can use it to plant corn or plant soybeans or plant cotton or rice or whatever it is that we're growing, that also obviously is a huge disturbance event for these ecosystems. We're completely clearing out that climax community that was there and replacing it with, for the most part, one single type of plant, whatever crop it is that we're developing. So anything that kind of removes the existing community but still maintains the soil and some of the plants and animals that were there are these big disturbance events that are messing with the climax communities. So another one that is partially natural and also partially human caused are what are called invasive species. And you guys may have heard of invasive species before. You may not have. They're a really kind of hot topic of research in the biology and ecology fields. So invasive species are non-native plants and animals. So plants and animals that are from a different region or a different country that are usually brought in either on purpose by humans or they hitch a ride on human boats or human planes, end up in a new area, and a lot of times they don't do that well and they die off. But sometimes when they're invasive species, they come in and completely take over that area. They disrupt the climax communities and they are really aggressive because A, usually invasive species are really fast growing, and B, they don't have any natural predators. So the stuff that would have kept them in check in their home region or home country, we don't have that here. And so they can kind of take over the community without being stopped by sort of the natural defensive. So a lot of times they reduce biodiversity because they kind of strangle out and wipe out a lot of the native plants and animals that were living here. So they make the communities less stable and less biodiverse, and it causes different plants and animal species that they're interacting with to potentially become endangered because their habitat is being taken over by this invasive species. So scientists have estimated that invasive species costs, especially in America, about $138 billion with a B, $billion worth of damages and control costs per year. So the amount of time and money it takes to control and contain and remove these invasive species is extensive, especially when it's a species that preys upon things like trees that would have been used for lumber or crops that would have been used for agriculture. So things like kongan grass and especially kudzu. Kudzu is a Japanese vine plant that was brought to the American South several decades ago. And in some places of Georgia and Alabama, it has just completely grown out of control and taken over entire ecosystems. So you can see there used to be big trees and bushes and shrubs in this picture. Now everything that is green in this picture is kudzu. It has all been completely covered and taken over by this invasive vine. So this is another kind of not as directly destructive way that climax communities get impacted, but it is having a big impact on the native species of plants and animals. So because they don't have any natural predators and are usually extremely fast growing and fast to reproduce, these invasive species move in quickly, take over quickly, and kill quickly a lot of the native plants and animals that used to live there and make up that area's climax community. So while scientists really like to see an ecosystem be at its climax community, have that high biodiversity and lots of different species all living together, there's a lot of different things that can come along and damage that and cause succession to have to be restarted, or in some place kind of completely take over that process. So succession is constantly going on all over the world all the time in response to different types of damages or impacts on those climax communities. All right. So does anybody have any questions about the climax communities, the invasive species, or the disturbances we're talking about? Angelica, the kudzu is a vine, I believe. Hold on, let me check that really quick. I'm pretty sure it's a type of vine. Yeah, a group of climbing, coiling, and trailing vines native to East Asia, but invasive in many regions of the world. So yeah, it grows on top of trees and other objects. So yeah, it smothers the other trees and plants under a blanket of leaves. So it was initially brought into the southeast, like Texas and Georgia and Alabama, because people thought it was pretty. It looked nice and ornamental, like on the sides of houses, and it was used to provide shade. But it escaped from people's gardens and stuff, completely covers the surrounding area so that all of the plants and trees that used to live there can no longer get the sunlight that they need in order to keep growing and reproducing. They're being completely covered and basically smothered to death by this vine. So I'm sure you can see there's probably going to be some pretty intense, yeah. So you can see in these pictures here, all these areas used to be all sorts of different grasses and flowers and shrubs and trees, but now it's all just kudzu vine. So yeah, it grows fast, it reproduces fast, and it's really hard to get rid of. It's really hard to kill off once it gets a hold of an area. All right, good questions, Angelica. Anybody else have any questions about invasive species, primary succession, secondary succession, climax communities, anything that we have talked about so far here this evening? All righty. So we'll go ahead and do kind of a quick look at the assignment that got posted for today. So if you already completed this assignment and you think that you did it pretty well, then that's totally fine. Or if you did it already, but after the notes tonight, you realize that you messed up on some stuff and want to go back and fix it, that is fine too. Essentially, I just kind of want you to use the notes and use what we've talked about today to fill in some information about these kind of major terms that we went over. So I want you to kind of use your own words to tell me a little bit about what is succession in general, what are primary succession and secondary succession, what are pioneer species, and what is a climax community. So as always, you can either answer it on the Google form here and just kind of fill in the blanks underneath the terms here. Or if you want to fill in the Google Doc, it's in the setup in kind of a chart form. So you can just come in and fill in on the little chart right here. your description or your answers for these different terms. You don't have to do both. They're the exact same thing. Just pick which one that you most like to use. I know a lot of people really like filling out the Google form, which is totally fine. But if you prefer filling out the chart on the doc, then you can do that one instead. Whichever one that you do is fine by me. All right, so does anybody have any questions about the homework or what you need to do for your Thursday assignment? All righty, y'all.